between men and women. For men have broad shoulders to contain their great brains, and women have large butts from which to bear children and sit upon. How can you take the church fathers who are translating the scriptures and working within the church in that period of time and separate their hatred for women, their misogynist attitude?
Yeah, that's the word I was going to apply, misogyny, yeah.
And you think that you can dissect that from the work within the church? You're sadly mistaken. We are influenced heartily by these men. And I'll say one thing and then we can go into something else. In 1611, when the King James Bible was produced, it was produced in part from the Geneva Bible. And those two Bibles became the standard of every other book that has come after it. So if we digress much from the Geneva and the King James, people shout and scream and say, "Oh, this is wrong because it doesn't follow."
Yes, tell me about it. I'm very this. I am almost daily braving the storm of that rage right now. Yeah.
Yes. So here in the South, we have a lot of King James only people because, to quote them, if it's good enough for Jesus, it was good enough for them. We'll just ignore that and go on. But what I'm saying is, even though we know the truth, even though when you talk to translators and people who work fluently with these languages, they will know the truth and they'll tell it to you. But when it comes time to translate the scriptures, they must follow this general pattern, because if they digress too much, if they diverge too much, that is, it is looked upon as a heresy and a bad translation. We're stuck.
Is that part of the reason why you believe they may be moving towards gender-neutral Bibles as well?
I think that actually is politically driven. I don't think it's driven by any kind of attempt to clean up the Bible. I think that is an attempt to enact their own political dynamics.
Yeah, and of course we've seen this. I mentioned to you a BBC series that I watched called Did God Have a Wife? And the show's historically very interesting, and there's a lot of accurate information there. Unfortunately, it has embedded within it what I have to call a feminist agenda as well. Yeah. You know, and I think both sides of this argument, maybe just to kind of balance what we're talking about so far, both sides of the argument where we tend to go extreme in one direction or another are not only providing incorrect information, but also a dishonor to the intent of doing these studies. What we're trying to do, in what I believe your research is showing and what I've tried to come out with, is to bring into the mix, so to speak, a balance again, something that's been missing. Yes. Religion is a male-dominated institution and has been so for all but maybe the first several hundred years of Christianity, in my opinion, based on my studies.
You're absolutely right, yes. And I think that that's an excellent point to make right here, is that at the time of Deborah and going back into Judaism, women seem to have more freedom within the society than they did after the 2nd or 3rd century. Now, it's one of the reasons I believe that the Gnostics were wiped out. We had this misogynist attitude, and the Gnostic Christians were elevating women to a status that was equal to men. They didn't have any problem in saying, wait a minute, there is, now, of course, we have to say that there are different types of Gnosticism. And one type said, look, there is no gender in heaven, and there shouldn't be gender here. And then you had the stories of Mary Magdalene, the Gospels of Mary Magdalene and the Gospel of Philip, and the others that were produced, and they reflected an equality. And as a matter of fact, in one of the scriptures it says that Jesus told Mary secrets that he didn't tell the others because she was his favorite apostle. Mm-hmm. And so we had this kind of conflict. And as time went on, and orthodoxy became what it was, which is a kind of a loathing of women in that particular time. By the time 1200 rolled around, the mid 1200s, the church finally had one major push to annihilate the last vestiges of Gnosticism, and the Cathars were exterminated. And there is a quote that says from the church, "Go into this region, kill everyone there, Christian, Gnostic, male, female, women, children, men, for God will know his own." And they wiped out an entire region, not just a city, a region, because they wanted to rid the world of this Gnostic plague.
Yeah, and see, that's the part of history, and I get this a lot from the King James Version Bible defenders. That's a part of history they conveniently forget when they're constructing their narrative about this. They conveniently want to forget. You know, they'll talk about the blood of Wycliffe, and I understand all that. I honor that completely. We talk about those who perished to bring the Bible forward in an era when it was suppressed by the Roman Church.
Yes.
My issue with that is that we've cut out large pieces of history that are in a straight line with that and ignored that in order to have a consistent narrative that says this is orthodoxy. And so people like you and I are largely painted as heretics and troublemakers because we bring up these inconvenient pieces of history that they have ignored and extracted from their narratives.
Well, it's a very simplistic view to think that world life and history are tidy. It's an incredibly, it is. It's a naive view to think that great men don't have great faults. We see it every day in our presidents. Light a cigar and think of Bill Clinton. I mean, he was a great statesman, still is, but great men usually have great faults, and there is some kind of balance. So you can't say that Wycliffe was all of this, or Luther was all of that. I mean, let's face it. Luther said of the book of James, I think it was, it's a straw gospel, a pissy little book that should be thrown into the river. He had a lot of problems with certain books, and if it were up to him, he would have gotten rid of the book of Hebrew and the book of James and a few others, and he had, let's just say, some very strong views and didn't bother to censor himself. After all, didn't he refer to the Pope as his infernalness, I believe? And so, and it's not something that I disagree with per se at that particular time, because that Pope did have its problems, but doesn't that just kind of prove the point?
So yeah, and like you said, history's messy, the narrative's kind of broken, and orthodoxy has ridden roughshod over so much of this that when somebody like you comes along with what you're presenting in a book that you're now in the process of writing, somebody like me comes along, and I was not alone in this. I actually have another Christian radio talk show host on the West Coast whom I had spent some time with discussing this. And I like everybody else, I saw it and I went, this is really uncomfortable. If I bring this out, a lot of people are going to be upset, and they were. But a lot of people were blessed by it too. And not just women. I expected that I was going to hear positive feedback from women. What I got men who went, wow, finally, we get some balance here. Because I think men look for this too. Where is the nurturing God?
See, let's look at that just a moment, shall we? Going back to Carl Jung, and I am a Jungian at heart. I believe that things happen from the inside out, not the outside in. My hardwiring is probably going to cause more trouble than my potty training, to compare Freud and Jung. So Jung had this archetype worked out, and he said, it starts with Eve, and I just read you all the things that people say in the Eve part of their life, the Eve period of their life. It's misogynist because we look at women as an object of procreation and sex, and it becomes kind of dirty. The next was Mary Magdalene, because you have these women who are capable and strong-willed and determined. And the next one is Mary the Mother, because you have women who you have removed the sexuality from, because if you remember, the church went through this evolution of removing the sexuality and almost gender of Mary. She first was the perpetual virgin, and then she was the mother of God, and then she was the Immaculate Conception. The Immaculate Conception is kind of interesting, isn't it? Because that speaks to the Immaculate Conception of Mary, that Mary was born without sin. Most Protestants think that the Immaculate Conception refers to Jesus, but it doesn't. It refers to Mary. And then after that, the church said that Mary was assumed into heaven and sits on the right hand of Jesus. And then after that, she was called in 1954, I think it was, the mediator between between man and Jesus. It wasn't that we couldn't go to Jesus, but we could whisper into the ears of Mary, and Mary could whisper to Jesus, and so things would happen. And then in the last few years, there's been a push to make her co-redemptress. Now, this is not doctrine, but there is a movement afoot in the Catholic Church to name her as co-redemptress. But in around 1579, she was called the Mother of all Christians, and she took the title of the Queen of Heaven. So here again, and let me say this, when she was assumed into heaven, and that was in 1950 when the Pope spoke from the seat of Peter about that, Carl Jung was still alive, and he put forth a statement that said, finally, we've arrived back at this evolution where we have a female in heaven again. And Carl Jung saw this as a needed psychological tool for man to have allowed his spiritual psyche, if you will, to evolve so that there is now another Queen of Heaven. Well, I agree with him that we should evolve and have this female face in heaven, but the truth was known thousands of years ago, because God was Ruach and Ruach was God. And we always had a female face in heaven, but the church tended to extinguish it, partly through linguistics and partly through stupidity. We have decapitated the female face of God. We have exterminated the sacred feminine.
One of the most difficult tripwire verses for me in the presentation I did was Proverbs chapter 1, where Solomon says, "My son, hear the instruction of thy father, and forsake not the law of thy mother." It's a very difficult verse, because if you can go back into the mindset of the Hebrew male, this